Greetings, I'm John Nash, the senior pastor at Mesa United Methodist Church. At the end of Genesis, we find Joseph and his 11 brothers living in Egypt, and Joseph tells the brothers that someday God will come and lead the people out of Egypt back to the land that was promised to them through Abraham. And then we turn and open up to the beginning of the book of Exodus, and we're told that a king has arisen who does not remember Joseph. And concerned about the large numbers of people that are coming, they're named as Israelites, he enslaves them and uses them to begin his great building projects. And thus we might see the book of Exodus as a continuation of Genesis, a sequel as it were. But that's not really what Exodus is about. Instead, we should see Exodus as its own complete story, a story that exists within its own framework, that what was established in Genesis, in particular of the covenants that we see in Genesis, continue through into Exodus, but that Exodus has its own unique story, its own unique perspective, and its own unique theology. That we should approach the book of Exodus as a complete work in and of itself. That there is not that connection that we might like to make between Genesis and Exodus. There's little connection between Exodus and the stories of the matriarchs and patriarchs we had found in the work of Genesis. While the title of the book of Exodus might indicate that the book's primary story is about the Exodus from Egypt, or being freed from slavery, of being liberated by God, it does play a part in the book of Exodus, but the majority of the book is about what happens after they have left Egypt, and in particular about the covenant that is made between God and the people at Sinai. The majority of the book is about the wanderings in the wilderness. The story of Exodus also tells us about why Jews do certain things, why they practice certain things in their religion, in particular the celebration and remembrance of the Passover. Exodus, therefore, is not really a book about an ancient story as much as it is about a reality for a lived religion today. When the Passover liturgy is read every year in Jewish homes, they do not use past tense verbs to refer to the Exodus story. Instead, all the verbs are in the present tense, that liberation and the God who does that liberation is still present, and that event is still happening even now and will continue to happen. The covenant is still alive. Now, covenant is not a word that we use a lot in Christianity, but it is something we find as a theme throughout Scripture. And as Christians, we talk about Jesus instituting a new covenant by water and the Spirit. Even our terms Old Testament and New Testament might be better understood as Old Covenants and New Covenants. Although whether the Old Covenants go away under Jesus could be a topic for another occasion. There were a number of covenants that we saw made in Genesis, in particular between Noah and Abraham. But what makes those covenants different from the covenant that we see instituted in the book of Exodus at Sinai is that with Noah and Abraham, the covenants were with those particular people. But the covenant at Sinai is with the entirety of the body of the Israelites. It's made with everyone. And yet, like in Genesis, the story of Exodus is told largely through the person of Moses. But like we talked about in the book of Genesis, tradition has held that Moses is also the author of Exodus. But there is nothing in the text, including any claim of authorship by Moses, that would give that claim a factual basis. And this idea that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch or the Torah, is not a new idea. We actually have writings from the church fathers early in the Christian church arguing that Moses, in fact, could not be the author of these books. There is now general consensus among most scholars that there are 3 or 4 different traditions that have been woven together by an editor at some point in Israelite history, probably during the time of the Babylonian exile. Like in Genesis, where I said one of the best places to see these different traditions being melded into one was in the story of Noah, in the book of Exodus, The best place to see this taking place is in the Exodus passages itself. As they are fleeing out of Egypt, pay attention to that there seems to be multiplications, repetitions of the story, except the stories are actually slightly different with each other. Another way to pay attention to this is in the name given for God. Sometimes the word will be translated as God. This is coming from the tradition which is typically known as Elohim, or the E writings, because Elohim is translated as God. But you'll also encounter God being referred to as Lord. In the New Revised Standard Version, the Lord will all be capitalized. The Lord here is coming from what is known as the Tetragrammaton, or the letters YHWH. That is the name that God gives to Moses when Moses says, "Who should I say to the Israelites is sending me?" And God says, "I am." The YHWH, sometimes pronounced as Yahweh. That's coming from the tradition that's known as the J tradition for Yahwist, with the German changing the Y to J. A final place that we can see these different traditions taking place is within who it is that's going to be the ruling priestly class. We sometimes have claims that Aaron and his descendants will be the leaders, the priests of the Israelites, and yet at other times we see Aaron being at best passive to what Moses is doing, and at worst of disobeying what God has called the people to do and leading the people down the wrong path. That then stands out in contrast to Moses and his leadership of the groups that become the Levites, become the priestly class of Israel. So we have this battle between whether the Aaronites will be in charge or the Levites will be in charge. So I encourage you to pay attention to these differences as you encounter them in the work, and look for other things that you might see to pick up different traditions that have been melded into this one document. There are several different themes and areas of importance that are emphasized in Exodus. One of them is about worship, and who it is that we are going to worship, and what worship means. One of the things that Moses asked Pharaoh to allow them to do is to go out into the wilderness so that they can worship their own God. But Pharaoh knows that if he lets them go to worship someone else, that they will no longer be worshiping him. And so he refuses to allow them to go. That their allegiance will no longer be to Egypt, but instead to this other god. Later, as they are wandering in the wilderness, this same theme of worship continues, as well as the theme of building upon this as part of the covenants and the breaking of this covenant several different times, and a theme we will continue to see throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. The core of the story is, of course, also about liberation. That the abused and the oppressed can and will be liberated by God. That they are not abandoned by God. That God hears their cries of despair. That God will respond, and the powers and structures and principalities and the agents of that oppression will be overthrown. What is also shown in this is that those who are oppressed are authorized to take responsibility for their own futures. That while Moses does not do the Exodus entirely on his own, nor does God encounter and do the Exodus entirely on God's own. Moses and God work together. Humanity and God work together to bring about God's will for the world. And that God yearns to be present in and for the community, but that God requires that community to be faithful to the witness and faithful to God's covenant. As I already said, whenever the Passover celebration is celebrated every year within Judaism, they do not talk about it as an event that is happening in the past, but instead that is something is happening right here and right now and will continue to happen. So too are we invited into the story of Exodus to cry out to God where we are oppressed and where we see oppression taking place, and to participate in bringing that to an end. But it also simultaneously invites us to see where we have been pharaohs, as where we have been agents of oppression, either directly or indirectly through the society in which we live, as well as to see where our allegiances and loyalties ultimately lie. What is it that we worship? Do we worship God, or are we worshiping something or someone else? The issues of Exodus are not the stories of a distant past. They are the same issues that face us here and now in our own lives. So I hope you enjoy your journey through the book of Exodus.